Okay, and welcome back to the MVP Interactive Podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Jesse Lovejoy, who is the founder of Lovejoy Strategies. Jesse serves as an advisor and programmatic design consultant within sports, museums, and nonprofit spaces to create bespoke experiences that educate, engage, and inspire. Partners include the Smithsonian Institution, the Golden State Warriors, Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum, Play Like a Girl, the Saban Center, and the San Francisco 49ers, coming to us live from the Chase Center as well. Jesse, welcome. Thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you. Yes. And as previously stated, from a very nondescript loner office in Chase Center, but an office nonetheless. Beautiful day in San Francisco today. So thank you so much for having me, James. And I'm excited for our chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll get right into it here. And, we like to kick off each podcast with a little bit of background of our guest. And as previously mentioned, you're heavily in communities and involved in museums, but, maybe you didn't start there in your early career. So we'd love to hear the journey on how this all took shape.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I went to San Diego State, studied communication, went into PR out of school. Worked in PR for about a decade, and realized, towards the end of that run that it wasn't for me. Multitude of factors there, but had always wanted to work with kids, had coached, had mentored, had tutored, had done lots of different things. It was an umpire. My first job I ever had was baseball, little league umpire. I think I was like 14, 15 years old. And so I took the opportunity to, hadn't married my wife yet, didn't have kids, very little responsibility. So broke off, started looking into education. I substitute taught for a hot minute. Didn't work out exactly the way I wanted it to. I taught language, English at a language academy for almost 3 years, which was really cool. It was, how to teach the English language through cultural assimilation, which is where some things started to happen. I started to think about leveraging things that people were interested in to teach them things. Then I ended up at the San Diego Hall of Champions, which is a museum in Balboa Park. It's unfortunately no longer there, but and that gave me the opportunity to start to marry sport and sport skill development and learning and kind of social emotional growth. And then the job with the Niners. So yeah, starting in communication, and working in, everything from brand strategy to hand-to-hand combat PR to strategic planning and all that stuff. It gave me the foundational skill set to move into a place where teaching and working with communities and now organizations that want to work with communities via education. It gave me kind of like the bedrock kind of knowledge base that you want to have in order to do those things. So very thankful for that time. Also very thankful that I'm not doing it anymore.
Right. Okay. And it's funny. Here's a little fun fact about myself as well. I was once a substitute teacher.
Oh, wow. Here we go.
Yeah.
Here we go. Yeah.
That. And as much as it was rewarding and I absolutely loved the experience, I too was a failed substitute teacher.
Yeah.
I think I'm thankful for every day, not to say that, it's not a great career, but it's just interesting how some of our failures turn out to be successful.
Sure. Well, since you double click that, I just want to tell a quick story, and I promise not to do too many of these, but so for me, I needed a quick path to get in the classroom. I just really wanted to see how it felt. So I substitute taught for the Catholic Diocese in San Diego. So no credential necessary, found that out, but you had to go meet with the nuns. I'm not a religious person, period. I didn't grow up in a religious family. And so it was like one of my first, kind of like organized experiences in the church. And it was really cool. And I really enjoyed being in a Catholic school environment. It wasn't that environment that taught me that I wasn't meant to be a classroom educator. It was more like the prep and all those kind of things that I wasn't really ready for. But it was a really neat kind of perspective changing moment for me, as only teaching can do. Anybody who's familiar with it, there's nothing like trying to share knowledge with a group of people that they don't have, that you're responsible for giving them, that will teach you a lot about yourself very quickly.
Sure. Well, I once heard that teaching is twice learned, and I don't think there's truer words, right? Because
I like that.
every single day, and I was trying to, by no stretch did I have a science background, but I was trying to teach earth sciences to high school students. And so I was learning or relearning, I should say. I remember taking the classes. And coincidentally, it was my hometown high school that I actually ended up substituting for, and was a junior varsity baseball coach as well.
Super cool.
There's your umpire in baseball.
I like it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of synergy here. This is going to be a good conversation.
That's absolutely. So you had mentioned rounding out your career at the 49ers museum. Talk to us a little bit about that. How does that, so, you kind of go into education, you work within some community programs, and then, quite arguably you're working with one of the best, sports franchises in the world.
Well, so I grew up in Santa Cruz, California, about 60 miles south of San Francisco. Still live there with my wife and kids. And my dad was the photo editor for the Santa Cruz Sentinel, small paper in town, for 40 years. So back in the late 70s, the Niners were horrible. And so it wasn't difficult to get a credential to shoot on the sideline, and nor was there any security at Candlestick Park. So my dad would just bring me along, and I would just hold his camera bag, and he just walked in because he knew the guys that were like at the gate. So it's a far different world now. Sure. But so I developed this love for the 49ers, right? It just like hardcore NFL, Niners and Giants, right? Like that's me and my dad, love language, my dad, my brother, my mom. Yep. So just had this incredible affinity for the organization. So at the time I was working this is back in 2012, I was working for that outfit in San Diego I mentioned, and, saw the posting for this role, which was, after the 49ers, got the proposition passed to build Levi Stadium, got the funding, things are happening, right? They put out the call for someone to do two things, essentially to create and build the 49ers museum, and to create and build an education program that would kind of run within the museum. And, I was working at a museum down in San Diego with sports, kind of focus and doing educational programming. And, I remember going to my wife and saying, hey, what do you think of this? And she's kind of like, well, do you want to go back up north? I said, yeah, I'd love to go back up there. And, one of those deals where you do it, but you don't really think that there's a solid shot. I'll never forget, I got a call from Keena Turner, the guy who won 4 Super Bowl rings with the 49ers back in the decade of dominance there. Ended up being one of the closest people to me, still is. And the rest is history, got the job, and, moved up. And my first year with the team was the last one in Candlestick. So it was 12 months of wearing a helmet or a hard hat and a vest and safety glasses to work, because we were building the stadium, we were building the museum. And then, parallel to that, we were figuring out, what is our responsibility to the community as it relates to education? Where can we be of service? And then what is kind of the unique thing that we want to focus on in terms of how to engage young people? That's how and then, we can go into EDU or the museum, depending on how you want to go for it. But both those things were very separate in the sense of the projects themselves, but very related in terms of how they were kind of growing together. And I learned a lot during that time period. I tell people, I now know when it comes time to remodel my house, I know what to expect. There's nothing like building something, like literally physically building something. Cost,
and then exactly twice as long as you think.
6 a.m. meetings every day, at the job site with, the architect and the electrical contractor and, whoever it is, and troubleshooting, whatever was going on that day. So super cool and challenging and fun.
What was Keena Turner's role at the 49ers at that point?
At that time, KT was, I think, vice president of player engagement. So basically, the entity that would oversee how the guys worked in the community, what their interests were outside of the game, facilitate continuing education if that was something they wanted, really just give them a place to go, to make sure that the needs outside of football are being met. So there's an office that does that at every pro sports team, right, in the country and the world, probably. So he was over that unit. And then he had just been tapped as a kind of core working group along with two other people, to kind of bring this 49ers museum idea along. Once the ownership decided they wanted to build it, they needed a set of folks that could kind of like steward the notion until they brought somebody on to lead it. And so he was doing that. The then VP of marketing was doing it. And then there was another guy, and I'll say Allie Toll. Hey, Allie, if you're listening. And she's at the Patriots now, and Mike Libby, a guy who was in the finance department and kind of the football analysis department. And so they were the three folks that were they turned into kind of like my board of directors. That's not the right term, but
sure.
So that's what KT was doing. And now he is, doing what he was doing then, except probably 3 or 4 levels higher. And he would probably bristle if you heard this, but he'll never hear this because he doesn't listen to podcasts. So he's essentially the consigliere to John Lynch now, like when they're talking about football moves, and he and John are very close. So I love KT.
Well, it's a good thing if he does hear us,
I hope he does. I hope he does.
We're climbing the ranks of the podcast.
There you go.
Rankings there. So I do recall at the start of Levi Stadium, there was some controversy in terms of the location, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where Candlestick in the heart of San Francisco, and so many great memories in terms of championship teams with Joe Montana, and even the early Barry Bonds days.
Sure. No championships then, but a lot of good baseball teams.
Yeah,
a lot of winning for the Niners in San Francisco, that's for sure.
Yeah. And so did any of that, in terms of the community, when you're thinking about a museum, and especially with education, and, did any of that, was that a potential hurdle for you guys, or how did you navigate that piece through the museum?
It wasn't a hurdle. I think to the York family's credit, and Dr. John York, Denise DeBarlo York, and Jed, the family that owns and runs 49ers, we never had conversations where it was like, oh, well, we have to come, make people love us down here. Like it wasn't that, everybody, the Niners have been trying to get a stadium built in San Francisco for 25 years prior to moving to Santa Clara. It wasn't like it just happened, right? So it was definitely something that people didn't love, but people kind of knew was in the works, because they wanted to keep the team local and needed to find a place to build it. It's not easy to do in the city or across the bay, has been proven by other franchises. So it was never about the challenge of kind of mitigating the dissatisfaction. It was more just about, how can we be a good citizen, right? How can we be a good community member? And it's really two different paths, right? The 49ers Museum is just about fans, right? And we never had a conversation that was anything other than, what would fans want? Like, what's our responsibility to and fans and alumni, and their families. What do we owe to the guys that came before us that allowed this place to get built, right? Because if there is no John Taylor, if there's no, Jerry Rice, if there's no, Joe Montana, if there's no Tina Turner, there probably isn't a Levi Stadium, right? To get super macro about it. So you had that. And then on the education side, it was really, hey, look, they had the 49ers Foundation had been supporting the educational ecosystems in the Bay for 30 plus years, just in grant making, right? But this was like, hey, we're gonna be here. This is a physical place. We're building the stadium. Let's use it, and let's use the museum to create a direct way for us to relate to the community. Yeah. So it was in the early days of establishing what went on to be called 49ers EDU. It was really about making sure that we built it in a way that was thoughtful, that we engaged the folks that we were going to be building for.
Sure.
So one of the things that I identified very early, and by very early, I mean like the first couple of weeks on the job, was, I needed a group of folks that were going to shoot us real straight in terms of what we were building, how to make sure it was valuable, where the bear traps were, where the opportunities were. And so that was one of the first things I did, was kind of curate this body of folks, an advisory committee, if you will, that kind of helped us make sure that what we were building was on point from an educational standpoint, and that it was constructed in a way that was really going to work within the environment where we were. So yeah, I think, I'm sure a lot more, if you were talking to someone who was selling tickets, right, or who was managing corporate partnerships, they probably have a much different breakdown on kind of how they dealt with that, which is a lot of folks being not super pumped that the team moved 40 miles south. But I think what quickly happened too was folks realized that, especially as you see teams move, like, what's the alternative, right? The alternative was the team goes, right? So and
Yeah,
that's happened way too many times.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, there's this overarching trend now to that, the stadium complexes, if you will, or where the stadiums are turning into mixed use lifestyle centers, right?
Yes.
And I don't know if San Francisco had that space. And, I've been to Levi's Stadium a few times, and, even at the Santa Clara Conference Center, you have space down there, and you do have the ability to kind of create this mixed use. And heck, I think there's even an amusement park of sorts right there.
Great America's right next door. Yep.
Yeah,
and related development, Stephen Ross's unit. Stephen Ross owns the Dolphins.
Yep.
They're building a massive complex directly across the street from Levi Stadium. So, and I haven't really kept tabs on how it's coming along or when it's slated to open, but yeah, you're going to have an LA Live for those of you who know LA. You're going to have that right across the street from Levi Stadium, I would guess, in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Which is going to be good because, from a guy who ran a museum, which is something that, is heavily dependent on flow and foot traffic and those kinds of things. Right. You could use that in and around Levi Stadium. But, from a opportunity standpoint, from what you've got around the stadium, and really from where you were landing in a community, because Silicon Valley, San Jose, Santa Clara, said objectively, doesn't have a great sense of place, right? You're never there feeling like, wow, San Jose, you know what I mean? There's nothing wrong with San Jose, don't get me wrong, but there's no real connection. It's tough because it's a very transient place. Like, people are there mainly to work, right? Or to be a part of the industry. There's not a whole lot of folks who are super prideful about being from that area. And now, as I say that, I'm probably going to catch heat. But
Jesse, if it makes you feel better, I'm so happy that you had said that, because, as a non-Silicon Valley tech founder, right, going to the mecca of technology for the first time for me was a very lackluster experience, because I look around, and I grew up in New Jersey. I'm like, oh, this is just a turnpike industrial park, right? Yeah. There's just like these parking spaces amongst parking spaces and mid-rise buildings, not exactly high-rise buildings. And it's like, wow, so I didn't have that sense of history or connection that you just mentioned there. So I think a lot of people, you're right. I mean, despite maybe Palo Alto or Mountain View, I don't know, maybe those communities are a little different.
No, they do. And I should say, like, in a micro way, you'll find it, right? Like, especially Palo Alto, because the farm, because Stanford, like you get these institutions that drive, passion, that drive interest. But on the whole, right, the region, what the Niners were able to capitalize on was the fact there isn't a big game in town. And I don't mean that from a sports standpoint. I mean that from kind of like a cultural connection standpoint. And one would argue probably whether they are that now, but I think that there was a big chasm there. And so coming into town was an opportunity. And the, 49ers EDU was one spoke on that wheel in terms of how to kind of establish the team's commitment to that region. And so it was exciting to lead that piece.
I will say, and I made this up in my head, it was in a total imaginary scenario, but I did attend conferences at the Santa Clara Conference Center. Yeah. Like, am I walking the halls of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and like the ghost of fear of like them selling their
probably at some point, right? But like I highly doubt there was a lot of high level dealings of early Apple and everybody there. No, you're more likely to find that if you probably go to the hiking trails in and around, Cupertino and that kind of thing. I would guess you'd find more of that. The ghosts would be more there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I've been to Levi Stadium a couple of times. I haven't attended a game there, but I've attended multiple events, and the facility itself is amazing. It is a well laid out facility that is definitely mixed use. And, because I've been there multiple times, as I mentioned, without ever seeing a game. Where exactly is the museum location within the confines there? And what could guests expect there?
Yeah. So it's on the northern side of the stadium, on the actual perimeter at street level. And it was designed that way so that folks could walk up without having to be in the security perimeter on a non-game day. So if you're, I won't start saying street names because they mean nothing to most people, but, just imagine street level northernmost part of the stadium, right in between the box office and the team store. And, that's a hard question to answer quickly, but what I'll say that we try to be very intentional about with the museum experiences, kind of multimodality, right? We wanted it to feel equal parts reverential and interactive, somewhat befitting of the area that we were in, but more in tune with how people experience museums and content. Some people are very didactic. They want to go in and they want to read a bunch of stuff and stand and look and feel. And increasingly, there are large swaths of the audience that just want to kind of pop through and punch a few buttons and maybe have an app that overlays their experience. So we did it that way, and again, to the York family's credit, this was a $20 million venture. Most of the time when you're talking about a sports museum, anybody out there who's been to a few knows that they're generally not designed with an architectural flair. Like they're just kind of very boxy. They're very, sterile. They kind of feel somewhat jumbled. Anybody been to Cooperstown? I mean, I love Cooperstown. It's incredible. And it's like, right. It's a pilgrimage, but it's also, I won't say the word I was going to say, but yeah, it's very cobbled together. It doesn't feel like something that was designed with a major architectural vision, but you wouldn't feel that way if you walked into the 49ers Museum.
Well, that actually, I'm sorry to interrupt here, but now that I'm thinking about it, because, as you mentioned, most of those facilities are nonprofits, right? And so when you have a $20 million runway to kind of build from the ground up, I mean, were you licking your chops? So
that was decided before I got there. So what I was licking my chops about was the chance to have an open kind of whiteboard to tell the story. So my job was less about, advocating for the budget, the square footage, that stuff was set. It was, okay, we've got 20,000 square feet. It's bi-level, right? We know in doing all the work we've done with our, key constituents, these are the kinds of things that folks want to see. So how do we do this in a way that's really cool? That was the fun part for me.
Yeah.
And to be honest, it was working with the Cambridge 7 is the group that did the architecture for the building. They also did the store. I've worked with them on a number of other projects. They're world-class architecture firm. They do aquariums and museums and all kinds of things all over the place. And so it was so fun working with them because I had never before had this kind of conversation, which is, okay, well, how do we make an experience out of the physical setup of the building? So learning about proximity, learning about, the concepts of compression and release in terms of how people move through spaces, right? Elevation, large form, small form graphics, the juxtaposition of fine art, like we did these incredible life-size statues of the 49ers Hall of Famers in the 49ers Hall of Fame gallery, studio in Brooklyn. Studio Ice is the name of it, does the pieces. And, laying those right up against an interactive kiosk where you can, quickly flip through pictures and highlights and bios and all that other kind of stuff. So that was the really intriguing part for me, was how to marry those things. So that the goal from my standpoint was, no matter what kind of person you are in a building like that, there's something for you here, and you will never go too far without encountering it. So what you would expect is, you would expect to go in and leave feeling very connected to the team via whichever kind of path of consumption that you like.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, no, I like that. Because I'd imagine it's a fine balance, and it's just by way of coincidence for our loyal listeners. Hearing our last podcast, we had Jorn from the Soccer Hall of Fame Museum, which
Jorn, you better be listening to mine because I listened to yours.
Yeah, we'll ping him on the socials and LinkedIn for sure. Where we had learned that there was quite a bit of a fully immersed, connected technology experience, as soon as you sort of registered into the experience, which as self-serving MVP Interactive, we love to hear that. And, that's kind of the world that we live in. But it sounds like, you were able to kind of really strike that balance between analog, and I don't say analog in a negative way, but non-technical.
Sure. No, it's very positive in a museum. You have to have that. I mean, that's what people expect.
Right. And so, maybe let's kind of jump ahead a little bit in terms of, you're calling in from the Chase Center. Is there anything that
Mhm.
we can tease here? Or, when we talk about technology and you in and around museums for the last 20 years, talk to us a little bit about some of the trends in technology that you've seen or what excites you for the future.
Yeah. Yes, I'm here with at Chase with the Warriors, and to their credit, not surprisingly, given how innovative the franchise is and the commitment to their community, they're thinking through, what are some ways that we might kind of look to broaden our impact to serve the San Francisco and Oakland educational ecosystem. So I'm helping them think through those pieces. Very exciting, and huge thanks to Mike Kitts and Ayana Moody and John Bevan, everybody here who's doing that. But to get more specifically to your question about kind of the trends, and I'm reshaping how you said it, but the trends and how people engage with technology in a museum and those kinds of things. In my experience, the tools have changed, right? What AR is now versus what AR was then. What even just the hardware, the size, the speed, the user experience on an interactive kiosk, like what it is now, what's capable of versus what it was then. This is 10 years ago.
I know.
Is literally light years different. So for me, I guess I would say the strategy and the approach hasn't changed all that much, but what the new technology and what all the advances in the platforms themselves have done is introduce speed, introduce nuance, introduce like opportunity to create more layers on top of the experience. So, for example, we did a what's the right word for it here? Geolocated isn't the right word, but you've got an app, you're kind of walking through a space, you get close to something, it's going to trigger, sure. a feed of content, right? And it's so rudimentary, based on like, I think about what it was versus what it could be now. Sure. So now, if you're doing the same thing, you're building something that's allowing me to use maybe a similar interface, a cell phone, but I can share socially, I can download content, I can interact with this probably in some kind of way. Back to your conversation that you have with Jordan, and I'm not going to try and pretend that I know everything about his building, but I know some of it. It's really just about depth, I think, and that technology facilitates a more like robust experience within these spaces. And to me, the important thing to think about as a purveyor of those things is exactly what you were talking about at the jump of this kind of line of thinking, which is the juxtaposition. Because to me, that's what makes it powerful in a museum space. It's different if you're going to say, like in a hyper interactive or innovation forward kind of venue, right? Sure. And this is the world that you work in, right? But if I'm going to a museum, in particular a museum about sports, I'm expecting to have some low-key, observational, reverential moments, right? If I'm in the Pro Football Hall of Fame and I'm looking at the busts, I want to look at those, right? And I want to, maybe not everybody's this way, but I think
that I want to make them talk to you.
Yeah, exactly. And you should. And the thing is, like, and most people, like if you surveyed 100 people that walked in the door, there'd probably be 50 that told you, like, I don't want to hear that. And 50 that said, I do. Yeah. And that's the point is understanding when to push those buttons though, sure. Where's the right moment? And that's where it's really important to have groups like yours, and interactive producers that know what they're doing in terms of how to, create the content, and just folks that design buildings that know the right places to plug things in terms of how people actually move through spaces. Because there's no question that there's no way you could do a viable or an enjoyable experience these days without layering a ton of interactive experiences and leveraging the high-end technology to do it, especially if you're building something new. And in my opinion, nor could you achieve the same goals without offering the opposite. And that's where the magic happens in my mind.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. You mentioned 10 years ago, and we look, that's sort of the nascent days of our technology. And we look back and we're like, oh my God, it's cringeworthy. But at the time it was the most, advanced. And we were doing these face filters prior, before Snapchat was even doing it. And I wouldn't have called it AR, right? But that's sort of what the nomenclature allows for now. And, but back to your sort of seamless digital touch points, we as a byproduct of COVID and sort of not having live events or people in seats, and we need to get really smart with how we were selling our services and offering value to our clients. And so as a result of that, we found opportunities in a very museum-like setting to work with universities. And we found that there's a real need for universities to memorialize the historic history of a said program, whether it's an athletic department or, faculty, staff, and what have you. So we actually had the opportunity to really design these mini museums, almost recruitment facilities for particular sports teams. Stanford, one of them, Cornell, another one, where building out a content management system allowed for a light but intriguing technical experience where you are navigating, you are learning, you're using touch screens. It's multimedia, so you can learn read the biography and then watch a highlight video of that individual. And so being able to kind of create that, it's not the most advanced technology, but for most people that don't get to interact with, say, an 80-inch screen, the touch screen, the sheer imposing nature of that and being able to see content is advanced enough, and it works within the setting. So I totally relate to what you're saying there.
I'm doing a project in Alabama, and we went and toured Alabama football or Alabama athletics. And so I know exactly what you're talking about, right. In terms of, and it's so interesting, the lens that you see these things through, right? Because it's not meant to be an experience that the public really interacts with. It's meant to be a decision maker between Georgia and Alabama or Ohio State and Alabama. So like the target audience for these things, I remember walking through, I don't know if you've ever been there, but you've probably been to others that have very similar things, but
sure.
They have this essentially this like hall of honor. So you're looking at Jalen Hurts, and here's, Derrick Henry and all these guys and all these things that they've done. And like, they've got.
Thanks for the Philly shout out there. Thank you for that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Always. And it's incredible. And to like borderline old dude, it's overwhelming. I can't, there's so much happening here. Yeah. But then I'm like, no, this is meant for 19 to 20-year-old kids.
Yeah.
And so, you have to look at it that way. And then what you're also capable of doing in that same space, even by just the slightest little change in location in the room or whatever, is pay the homage to past, right? To look to future, and technology and the way that it operates and the kinds of things that y'all do facilitate that in a way that wasn't available, at least at that level, 10 years ago.
Sure. Well, I know we're talking about technology in the future and things, and I want to make sure that we touch on and highlight some of your education past again, in terms of, when I first was reading your bio, I kept reading STEM, and that's what I, formerly knew and were aware of from an education standpoint, but you work within a STEAM education community. One, differentiate the two, and two, tell us a little bit more about that before we wrap here.
Sure. Well, I mean, the simplest sense, it's obviously just the difference of a letter and an acronym, right? Which is the inclusion of the concept of art within the concepts of science, technology, engineering, and math. And this is one of those situations where, depending on who's listening to this, it's either a 30-second conversation or it's a 3-hour conversation, because, a lot of folks will say, from a purist standpoint, mathematics really is the major umbrella under which everything else falls. Other people will talk more about the sciences. But what we're talking about, and the majority of work that I'm doing, is really about changing the way young people are oriented towards these subjects, because the majority of the projects I'm working on are aimed at kids coming furthest from resource and opportunity. And when you're doing that, you have to understand, that sounds preachy. The majority of these young people, they don't have an interest in STEAM or STEM, not because they're not great at learning it, because they don't see it. They don't see relevance. They don't, understand why it should matter. And, when you're looking at what the opportunity is there. It's really to use these common connectors, to use the power of sport, to use other shared interests to get them to lean into these things. So all of that backdrop is just to say that, when you talk about the inclusion of the arts, one of the things that I always say is problem solving is an innately creative exercise. So, and not that those other disciplines don't involve creativity, but allowing and articulating through curriculum development or articulating through pedagogy the influence of art on a kid's experience and how they address these things is really powerful. Yeah. Because when you think about the way that kids are asked to learn now, and I'm not going to do a back in my day moment, but it's just
got a 14-year-old daughter now, and
how different it is. Like the process through which they're asked to engage themselves in learning, the outcomes they're expected to show, it's just so different. So because of that, you lean into project-based learning, right? You lean into social emotional skill development. You lean into the things that and I say you when I mean the programs that I'm working to build, because that's what kids are getting met with. But before you can do any of that, you have to create an interest. You have to develop a passion. You have to open a window. And so art can do that. The creative disciplines can do that in a way that many of the others can. And really, just to get maybe as direct as possible, it's really important in my mind, to include and to work from a STEAM perspective, because you have to get young people to understand that everything inherent to problem solving and learning is already inside them. It's this kind of curiosity, this place of exploration, this place of, and I don't say invention in a practical sense. I say it in a colloquial sense. I can, if I see something in front of me and it's a problem for me to solve, the first place I'm going to go is going to be to a creative one. So I think that's why I like to work in that sphere, but it's also not that different. It's not like there's this universe over here, STEAM, and this universe over here, STEM, and never the two shall meet. For some people, it's very interchangeable. But where it does become important is when you actually get to designing what the lessons are, when you get to thinking about the language that you use. Right. And the other thing that including art in your approach does is it opens up the opportunity to teach about music, to teach about graphic design, to teach about, we had a really cool lesson and experience we had in Levi Stadium because of the art collection that was curated to fill the building, which is all local artists. And so you want to talk about a diverse plethora of modalities. I mean, it's everything: sculpture, fine art, graffiti. And so you can create this wow moment for young people.
Yeah. And I think it's a more real world example of what the future holds for these kids, right? Because not everyone is a scientist, not everyone's a mathematician, and not many jobs fall in those two buckets, right?
No.
It's in the creativity, and whether you're in business, the social sciences, or what have you, being able to be a broad thinker, to conceptualize, philosophize on things that, aren't as binary as ones and twos.
Yeah, sure.
Is really important. And, I see it with my own daughter, where the methodology in her school is, all right, well, even still to a degree, it's kind of old school and like, all right, memorize this. And then great, we can teach you to memorize things, but how's that going to help you in the workforce when you need to think on your own and, really be abstract with problem solving? So
absolutely.
I love that.
And it's, not to get too far down the rabbit hole on this, but I think, to tie back into what you're saying and really just that realization and visualization for kids, it's, a lot of times now what so many jobs that are in industries that are booming are in analytics, they're in data aggregation, they're in data interpretation, they're in the use of those things to fuel AI and all these other things that are taking us forward in terms of how everything works. But the outcomes of those things are human experience. They're fan experience in the sports context. So when you're asking someone to think about, for example, how is AI or data analysis related to what I see on a scoreboard? they have a notion of what the scoreboard looks like, right, which is an A concept in the curriculum, right? They think about that visually. They think about that critically. They don't think about that, mathematically. They don't think about that scientifically. And you can back them into that, by allowing the relationship to come forward the way it organically does for kids.
Sure. Well, Jesse, we are unfortunately at our time. We like to give our listeners an opportunity to reach out to our guests here. And so whatever you're comfortable with, whether it's your phone number, your home address, no, I'm kidding there, but your socials or best point of contact, give us a way to reach out to you.
Sure. Well, you can find me at Mitchell's Cove in the water, just about every day in Santa Cruz. No, I'm just kidding. So LinkedIn, Jesse Lovejoy, you can find me there. There are a few Jesse Lovejoys, but if you Google Jesse Lovejoy Strategies, which is the
Jesse
name of
Lovejoy, is that your handle?
Lovejoy Strategies is the organization I founded not too long ago, literally a couple months ago. So
congratulations. Welcome.
Thank you. I do have a website for that that's up. And Jesse at lovejoystrategies.com is my email address. So any one of those works. And, I will just say to anybody listening who is thinking, on a scale of 1 to 10, they're at like a 3 or above in interest in anything I've said, just reach out, because I really enjoy talking to folks and just, seeing what people are thinking about.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. We certainly could have kept this going, but we wanted to be respectful to your time. I know you're busy with the new project, but Jesse, this was great. And maybe, hey, there's no reason not that you cannot come back, right? So maybe at the completion of this project,
I would love to.
All right. Awesome.
That would be awesome.
Right.
So look, James, I really appreciate the time. I'm, hoping that things continue to go great for what you're doing, and I'm a big fan.
Thank you. Yeah.
So maybe I'll come back, and to everyone out there listening, I hope things are going well for you too.
All right. Well, thanks again for another edition of the MVP podcast. Until next time, James Giglio.